Welcome everyone. I'm Sharon Reed and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our Conversations and Connections series. And today our focus is Satirical Slights, Legacies of British Caricature. We're pleased to have with us today former Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming, Katherine Hart, and Dartmouth Senior Lecturer in Art History, Kristin O'Rourke. Together, they will highlight 18th century visual satires by William Hogarth, Thomas Rowlandson, and James Gillray, and then talk about their influence on visual satire today. We are recording this program, which will be accessible on our YouTube channel in the coming days, the link for which we'll send out tomorrow. If you have any questions at any time during the presentation, don't worry about waiting or, you don't want to forget it. Go ahead and put that right into the Q&A field and we will get to those. And now I am happy to turn it over to Kathy Hart. Kathy?
Thank you, Sharon, and good afternoon, everybody. Today's topic, as Sharon mentioned, is visual satire. And this program came about from a small show I curated as right before I retired from the Hood of 18th and early 19th century British satirical prints given to the Hood Museum by Jane and Raphael Bernstein. It is part of a suite of shows that take place over the summer and fall titled A Legacy of Learning that highlight the many works of art that they have given to the museum. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them personally. Their gifts have made a great difference in my career at the museum, and I so greatly appreciate their generosity. When I was asked to give this webinar, I wanted to turn once again to one of Dartmouth's greatest resources, members of its faculty. In this case, Kristin O'Rourke, Senior Lecturer in Art History. For the past number of years, she has taught a popular course on satire and the history of satire. And I thought it would be interesting to show a few prints from the Bernstein gift and touch on the influence of what many call the golden age of British caricature on the satire of today. So we can show some of those links. Kristin specializes in French art of the late 18th and first half of the 19th century, centering on institutions of the art world, such as the museum, the academy, art criticism, and the salon. She received her PhD at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Her research interests include gender studies, art institutions, the myth of the artist, Paris, graphic arts and new media, and of course, satire. Thank you, Kristin, for being part of today's program. So to start, I will introduce you to the three artists whose work is part of the Bernstein gift. Can you roll the slides, Kristin? Thanks. These are the three artists represented in the show called Pinpricks and Pomposity at the Hood. William Hogarth, James Gillray, and Thomas Rowlandson. All sort of interesting artists and also people who did a variety of different types of things. William Hogarth actually was a painter and also a printmaker and also an entrepreneur. He had a thriving print publishing business in which he printed and promoted his own work, and later became Sergeant Painter to the King. Rowlandson was somebody who did very beautiful watercolors and was known as sort of one of the premier watercolorists of his day, in fact, any day. But he also did very raunchy pornographic images as well to make some money. He sort of came in and out of money, so he sort of delved into the popular print trade in order to make some cash. Gillray was, and none of these people were sort of born into higher level. They're more sort of sons of tradespeople or merchants or a soldier. They're not sort of higher levels of society. Gillray was somebody who wanted to be a reproductive engraver. In other words, he would be part of this business where print publishers would take paintings and ask an engraver to make a copy of it, and then they could print multiples. And as such, they would be disseminated. And he wanted to do that, which was a perfectly respectable trade. However, he was rejected, and I think he sort of interjected a little bit too much of his personality into these prints. They didn't look like pure copies, so he ended up being, to our great sort of, benefit, going into caricature and visual satire. Next. So to get in a little bit into the history of how caricature sort of came about in England, we look back to the 16th and 17th century in Italy, where you have very prominent artists, Bernini and also Carracci, who are, for their own amusement, doing quick sketches of different people, sometimes mostly character studies or types on the right by Carracci. But in a case here where you actually have a caricature of a known person, which is Cardinal Borghese by Bernini, and this type of work was sort of passed around. People would laugh about it. They would do it for the amusement of themselves. It wasn't part of any public sphere necessarily, but this sort of trade, people, artists who were going to Rome to study or going to Italy to study, they picked up on it. It was a popular pastime, and it eventually makes its way to England. Next. So in the 1830s, there's an artist named Arthur Pond who publishes a book which reproduces via etching some of these Italian caricatures, and sort of starts to circulate this sort of pastime where you can sort of draw a picture of your friend, or as an amateur, draw a picture of your friend, exaggerate their features, have some fun at their expense. The British are very good at that, and that became sort of circulating around in the 1730s, late 1730s. Hogarth, who is sort of well established by 1743 when this etching is created by Hogarth. And by the way, I'm putting green at the back as the background for the Bernstein prints, so you'll be able to know which are some of the prints you could see in the show. Hogarth did this print called Characters and Caricaturas, where he is sort of making the case that what he's doing is character, not caricature, and therefore his people are more like the person you might meet in the street, or somebody whose sort of life you're gossiping about, that it would be somebody whose face is slightly exaggerated for effect, but not caricature, where there is a much more sort of a charged, loaded, exaggerated type of image. So he did this print to show that what the differences were between character, depicting character, and depicting caricature. And you can see at the bottom, he's shown these sort of images that are after Raphael of characters, sort of noble or interesting characters. And on the right, caricatures, which he's picking up from the Italian caricatures, including Leonardo, who did grotesques, as they are labeled. And this wasn't very successful for him because he continued to be labeled by the word caricature, but what he was doing is more situational visual narratives satires. And he really didn't consider himself to be doing this type of thing called caricature. Next. So in visual satire at this same time, or right before this, this is a satire from the late 17th century during the time of the bloodless revolution, where the Stewarts get thrown out because of the predilection toward Catholicism. The Duke of York, who succeeds his brother Charles II. There's you have these type of emblematic satires, which are symbolic satires, and they don't rely on caricature, and they often have a lot of text involved with them. The characters there, you have, for instance, this figure with a mitred hat representing the Pope. You have a figure, the main figure of this caricature is this dog, spotted dog in the middle, and he has a broom on the back of his rear end, which is his printer, Henry Broom. So there's these associations with people's names, and they make these sort of clever associations, but they're very topical. you wouldn't, looking at them now, you would not get what they were talking about. And so they're pretty dense. And but it is one strain of sort of political or social satire that sort of exists prior to the introduction of caricature in the 18th century. Next. So in the early days of Gillray, he starts out, caricature is sort of gradually introduced. It's popular by the 1760s. So here we have prints sort of at the beginning of Gillray's career, and both of them, but shows his transition to using and incorporating somebody's known face into a satirical print. The character in both cases is Charles Fox, who is a Whig politician, one of the main prominent politicians, a liberal politician who was appreciative of the ideals of the French Revolution later on, and also interested in the abolition of the slave trade. Here's a print which shows him as a literal fox on the left. And that's sort of typical of these emblematic prints, as people would know who he was, and he was so prominent. Here on the right, Gillray sort of hedging his bets. He's showing him as Satan from Paradise Lost by Milton is the scenario. He's standing on a roulette wheel on top of the world, indicating his penchant for gambling. He has a foxtail coming out, so he's making sure it's Fox. But he's showing his face, and you have the face of George III in the firmament. So this is sort of the beginning of sort of inserting people's faces into this. And how would people know if they didn't have the foxtail? How would people know it was Charles Fox? Well, there's a burgeoning print trade, and that includes reproductive prints of portraits. And people are selling these of prominent people. So if you're famous or prominent, you often had these prints made after they were in multiple. They would be in print shops. People would see them. And often, so people would know what somebody might look like. A caricature of that person would be familiar. And it came to be that these prominent people, politicians and people who were aristocrats or leaders of the social scene, would be more known by their caricature than they would be ever known by their actual portrait. Next. And here it gives you an example of sort of the scene where you can see that this is a public spectacle. These are print shops. They're shown with people outside, people from different classes often looking at the print shop. The latest sort of gossip would be in the latest print. We know Gillray went to Parliament and listened to speeches and then went home and did a print that night or the next day. We know this because the prints are dated at the bottom, and often they give the particular date, like February 7th or whatever in the year. So these are two prints in the Hood collection, by the way, and it can show you. So you don't have TV, you don't have movies, you don't have internet, you don't have memes, you don't have TikTok, but this is how people got their latest gossip. Next. Another sort of activity that would happen as sort of a parlor game or sort of a social activity for people who had leisure time would be the making of silhouettes. And this sort of goes alongside the rise of caricature. And this apparatus, which you can see here, is that there's a light that is backlighting this woman who's seated in a chair. There's an easel and a piece of paper. Her shadow is cast on the paper, and the person on the opposite side is tracing her silhouette or her profile. And as this came to be, and people are interested in, amateurs are making silhouettes as well as there are some professional silhouette makers, people began to have sort of conversations about people's attributes, like whether they had a big nose or a strong chin, or if they had a large forehead, and attributed moral and sort of character traits to their physiognomy, to what their face looked like. And that obviously is in the air. There's a guy, a Swedish philosopher named Lavater, who writes about this, about reading people's faces. This develops into a very dark history later on, with stereotyping of race and religion, and othering people. And so it is a part of this history, and it's also can be studied. But this is part of what it is. And you want to next? I wanted to show you, this is another gift from the Bernsteins, a print from them of Hogarth, where you can see this is not one of his narrative serial prints, this is a standalone print, but in this print, believe it or not, he's making a political statement. He's against the suppression of playwrights and against Robert Walpole, who was very powerful prime minister of George II in the earlier part of the 18th century, had an act in 1737 which suppressed and gave the ability to censor playwrights. And then there were patent royal companies, theater companies. So he's looking at these actresses are about to perform a play that will be suppressed the next day when the act goes into effect. He's doing this retroactively. He's making this print about a year later, but it's showing him making this point, but he's also giving you a lot to look at. These Hogarth's prints are extremely dense, has a lot of things, but you can see there's so much going on in there. And he meant that the audience should be able to read. It's not something you get immediately quickly, though there are some things. He meant you to read it like reading a novel. His good friend was Henry Fielding, The Rise of the Novel. He was interested in these as sort of visual novels. And here you have a bunch of characters. You have an actress playing Diana. She's only partially dressed. Another one on the right. Juno. You have Ganymede in the corner left with the eagle as Jupiter. He's showing them in a dilapidated barn. It's a reversal between the very high with the goddesses and undercutting it by showing sort of the regular behind the scenes actors who are acting out these high roles. Next. Gillray is a up and coming. This is 1787, a few years after that Charles Fox image. He's coming into his own. He still wants to show you how good he is at portraits. He still has that axe to grind. So you see George III and the Prince of Wales here on the right, dressed in female costume. They're very well represented. Queen Charlotte is caricatured. There's a lot of misogyny in these prints, without question. But this is sort of a contemporary issue as well. They're eating out of a bowl that's in front of the treasury labeled John Bull's blood, and they're essentially eating money, which is the taxpayers' money. So it's about sort of the prophecy, and it's still a debate, how much money goes into the monarchy. They're shown sort of shoveling the money in. It's going into money bags that are part of goiters or craws. And Gilray's picking up on something else here. He's combining political with also what's going on contemporaneously, because there was a sideshow advertised in one of the papers. That's why we know about it, one of the journals or news sheets, that advertising a sideshow of people with monstrous craws or goiters. So you could pay money and go see them. So he's showing people would know these people might be on the streets in London as a sideshow, and he's picking up on that to use it. So contemporary illusions. Next. This is a little bit later in 1792. We're after Bastille Day here. It's a more gentle caricature. There is some concern about all of this what's going on with the French Revolution across the way, across the pond, not across the pond, across the channel. And so here is one of the Prince of Wales on the left, a voluptuary, enjoying, digesting, and then Temperance and a frugal meal on the right, contrasting George, the parents and the son. So George III and Queen Charlotte are eating salad, drinking water. They have slip covers. So somebody who was sort of a middle-class person may relate to all this. So he's one of you. He's not somebody who's spending a lot of money on his furnishings. You have an empty picture frame. but he's going after the Prince of Wales. Now, Prince of Wales was a prominent Whig. He supported the Whig Party and the Whig politicians. And he's being attacked here as a voluptuary. Once again, he's a gambler. You have sort of gambling. He's sort of digesting. He has a huge stomach. So this body. And then if you notice here on the top, his coat of arms are a plate and a knife and fork. Next. So some of the tropes and techniques of satire, you have hyperbole or exaggeration, allegory, seeing that, high versus low, parody, reversals, gender reversals, having the Prince of Wales dressed as a woman. You often see that as a way of undercutting the power or masculinity of some of these figures. Puzzles and riddles, illusion, and always the situational, sort of combining maybe a couple of narratives or 2 or 3 narratives in one, allusions to literature, to plays, bodily functions, sex, sort of elimination, scatological is very present in these caricatures. Outward aggression toward and showing them as being betrayers or casting very bad light on the figures, and puns. Next. And here I want to show you a case of parody. This is Henry Fuseli's very Gothic, sort of well-known painting called The Nightmare. And then Rowlandson has put Charles Fox as the figure of the collapsed female here in the nude. And sort of it's a way to undermine or undercut him, to make fun of him, and show him as sort of wilting lily, so to speak. This idea of how gender plays into all this comes into it as well. And obviously, a lot of people would have known this particular painting because there are a number of variations. Next. And I was talking about sort of, we know there's a lot of satire today, and stand-up comedians, Margaret Cho, different other people get fairly sort of out there in terms of their humor. And that's also the case in England. You don't have it in the Victorian period, it goes away. But here is where the King of Prussia's daughter came over to marry the Prince of York, the second son of George III. A lot, just like today with Meghan and Harry and William and Kate and Diana and Charles, a big hullabaloo around royal weddings. And they apparently decided one feature of the new bride to fixate on was her dainty feet. And so Gillray takes advantage of that and makes this this caricature, which is one where you have to know a lot about 18th century society to get the point. Next. One of the most famous caricatures, satires, is by Gillray, which is an attack on sort of empire building by both the British and the French. You have Little Boney, which he created, this caricature of Napoleon as a person of small stature, and William Pitt, the prime minister, and they're dividing up the world. So Gillray often sort of, he might be paid to go against one person, but he goes against also another person on the other side in the same print. And so he's actually not, even though he's being paid to do a lot of these caricatures, or it might be somebody else's idea, a lot of times it's his idea, but he always manages sometimes to skewer both parties. And that is absolutely something, it shows a certain freedom of expression, even though he's being paid. Next. And they're carving up the plum pudding there, which is, once again, people can relate to. This is the last print I will show, and it's another Bernstein gift. It's about the collapse of the Grenville administration. Came in 1806, was gone by 1807. Grenville was trying to promote rights for Catholics. George III was having none of it. But in the midst of the scandal, it was called the Broad Bottom administration because it was broad bottomed. It had that was a reference that there were people from both the Tory and Whig party. You had people from both parties. It was a coalition party. And that that is the case why it was called broad bottom, but obviously Gillray takes advantage of it, makes people literally broad bottomed, and he's putting the Earl Temple, the head of the Board of Trade, who was thrown out of office with the rest of the Grenville's cabinet, and he was accused of stealing office supplies. So you can see he's cast as Daedalus, who's the Greek hero, whose wings are melting. They're made of wax to escape, the labyrinth of the Minotaur. And what's coming out of his wings are quills or office supplies. And he's landing on this spike. So there's a sort of a humor in the comeuppance of the high brought low, which we also see today. So with that, I would just sort of a brief introduction of some of these caricatures and some of the themes. And you can see its liveliness, and it certainly has liveliness in the satire we see today. And Kristin, I'm handing it over to you just to bring this a little bit of history, and also what some of the things we can look at that have happened in the late 20th and early 21st century. And the relation.
Excellent. So thank you, Kathy. I always love looking at these images with you and listening to you, particularly when you are guest lecturing in my class, which hopefully you can do again in the future. I will shift gears, both going back in time, and then we'll end up in our time period. But I just wanted to sort of put also these 18th century prints into the context of where satire really gets its origins. And that's in the old comedy in the Greek classic period of Athens, and in the form of the surviving plays of the writer Aristophanes, who was a comedian. His works are called old comedy, but we refer to them today as satire. And we really only have these works by him, potentially just a small fraction of works that he completed and wrote, and which were competitively performed in these long theater cycles in Athens, for instance, but also traveling around. So this kind of notion of public performance of satire, public performance of critique on powers that be, I think is very closely related to both the print trade in the 18th century and someone like this prolific etcher like Gillray, and then in the 19th century, the lithography of someone like Daumier, who produced many, many prints critiquing the July monarchy, critiquing the king, and presenting them in a humorous fashion. So the importance of humor is something that we still see in our, in today. If you don't have a kind of humorous mode of delivery of attack, then some of your satirical import just might fall flat. So there's a really a fine line between attacking someone and making kind of political attack, or even attack on someone's character, versus couching it in humorous terms. And so satire, I think, functions across the centuries and up through today because we can laugh at it, and we can laugh at the object of critique, which sometimes might even be ourselves. And this was, of course, something that Aristophanes brought into the public sphere in these plays that he wrote, and then which was continued in the Roman period. So just, some quick ideas about these theater plays, speaking directly to the public. And this is something that, I'll talk in a second, we'll switch over to thinking about TV and video, that these comedians or the theater performers were speaking through the voice of the playwright, like Aristophanes, directly in the public sphere. So speaking to people about their own city, about powerful figures, public institutions like the law courts, monarchy, people in positions of power, mocking them, but in a humorous fashion, whereby perhaps direct confrontational speech may be more curtailed. Humor is able to carry and using these various different dramatic devices is able to kind of carry the point in an entertaining fashion. So Roman satire in the works of Horace or Juvenal, which, one is slightly more mild, the Juvenal tradition, a little bit darker, more critical, more acidic, coming directly on the, building upon the tradition of Greek literature. And just to bring back Kathy's slide here about these various techniques and tropes, we see these in still images. We see them in 18th century and 19th century prints. We see them in 20th century photography, photomontage, collages, and we certainly see them happening in moving images. So when we think about television, we think about film, and today video clips. So all of these kinds of things, like a sort of aggressive stance, but yet couched in humorous terms, and upending power structures. So bringing the high low, elevating the low, and these reversals, not only of status, of gender roles, we see them still today. We think about things like Mardi Gras, we think about things like Halloween, where people take on different personas, which are at odds perhaps with their own kind of day-to-day status, but doing them in usually a humorous and kind of exaggerated fashion. So that can be, of course, just a kind of performance, but it also can be something satirical and pointed. Okay, so I wanted to jump into, in the interest of time, we're going to look at, if possible, maybe some clips, but we'll also include some links either in the chat or later tomorrow in the follow-up. But in my class, I talk about satire TV, so about the concept of news and politics in a satirical fashion. And Saturday Night Live, of course, is something that we're all familiar with. It's been around since the 1970s. And then two kind of major TV shows, The Colbert Report and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart in the 90s and the 2000s. Of course, The Daily Show is still on with a different host. The Colbert Report has morphed into Stephen Colbert's late night show. But if we think about these really important kind of paradigms of satirical television, broad-based, large audience, quick format, a lot of changeover and topicality in terms of what they reference. And also, these shows are bringing politics into the sphere of entertainment, which is a little bit like what Kathy was just talking about in the prints. Saturday Night Live, for instance, of course, has the broadest audience because it is network TV, and it's also been on for decades. The Colbert Report and The Daily Show on the Comedy Channel had a more of a niche audience, something that's referred to as kind of post-network. Now we're in the era, of course, of the internet and social media. So things have gone even beyond, these kinds of changes in the media landscape into the world, of course, of YouTube and other kinds of social media dissemination. So, but just to think for a second about how Saturday Night Live has really informed our understanding of politics over the last several generations, honestly. Humor about the presidency, pointing out the kind of personalities and human foibles, and sometimes equalizing them. So this is part of kind of the danger of something that's so broad-based, broad-bottomed, shall we say, like Saturday Night Live, is that perhaps you're kind of equalizing the foibles of people in different positions of power, when perhaps maybe some are worse than others, or some are less, less harmful than others. So we think, of course, of political impersonation. Someone like Chevy Chase, bringing Gerald Ford, making fun of Gerald Ford, Phil Hartman as Ronald Reagan. Of course, Phil Hartman did a number of characters. Political humor as a kind of brand. So something that's almost for sale in a certain way. And just running through a few others, the actors change, but these are all about kind of topicality, about impersonation. So, and then we have to sort of ask ourselves, is this something that is successful? Is it something that's critical? The real desire of satire from the ancient world through today, or the real impetus of satire, is actually to point out problems, not necessarily to offer solutions, but rather to bring a kind of truth to a subject matter that might be buried under sort of the bells and whistles of a kind of polished veneer. And here you have, of course, multiple Emmy-winning impersonations of different real political characters. And you can see there's kind of sometimes a back and forth between the entertainment world of a kind of celebrity politics and real politics. You know, Sarah Palin became pretty well known in the face of Tina Fey's brilliant impersonation of her. So similarly, you could say that people become more human in that sense too, rather than kind of taking her personality, which appeared at the, Republican events or different conventions, and critiquing that. We're actually talking about the impersonation of her and the sort of tension between how the celebrity, embodies that particular person, and whether or not it's kind of critical, or it's harmful, or it's humorous, or it's humanizing, and does it help their career? It's a little bit like the idea of, no publicity is there's no such thing as bad publicity, that whenever you're on TV, that's somehow in your favor, even if you're being made fun of. And I think we could say the same with many prints over the years. Okay, so one, of course, the elections are always rife for making fun. In 2016, 2020, of course, Saturday Night Live really every single week had an image of the Democratic debate, had a cold open, so to speak, a sort of pastiche of the stage, a real imitation, something that looks real, even calling it, the NBC News Democratic debate, the ABC News, using their real logos, staging, kind of restaging the actual debate, but through parody of the candidates, taking on their mannerisms, their way of speaking, the topics that they make reference to, and really kind of jumping into their individual characteristics. And so it is caricature on some level because it's exaggerated, it's hyperbolic, but on the other hand, it's funny, it can be endearing, particularly as you see on this slide, we have, the persona of Bernie Sanders, who was somebody who is rife for satire in and of his own right, but endearing in a particular way. I think in the interest of time, I won't show the clips. I'll just kind of point them out, and we can talk about them more in the Q&A. But one of the, there's brilliant clips from Saturday Night Live over the years. This one about Reagan as a kind of contrast between his almost simple sounding language in the public sphere versus this kind of genius political mastermind in the background, which represents a kind of role reversal, an unexpected twist that might bring up some of the truth of that administration. Who knows? Similarly, another brilliant one of Clinton at McDonald's talking to the public, and one of the best of the Democratic debates of this one with a full field. Here's Elizabeth Warren, where, the parody, this kind of imitation of the actual event versus the satire. And then we have to think, was there a critical point? Were they just going for a laugh? Did they know, was it too even-handed, for instance? So I'll just present also a little bit on Jon Stewart and Randy Rainbow, and then we'll save some time for questions. So what I really love about these television satires is that they are so real in a sense. They create this kind of mimetic representation of the debate, of the news network, of the anchor sitting there talking to the camera. And they raise questions about what's fake and what's real. Part of their critique is to say that the real news, the so-called straight news, as scholars often refer to it, is actually manipulated. It's cut and edited. It's reduced to sound bites. It's quite artificial. The person reading a teleprompter hasn't really done the research or done any of the writing. And so someone like Jon Stewart is really making a parody, critiquing the whole genre of the news form. And he also operates, just like the Greek poets, as in the chorus, as an expression, as a viewer surrogate, so to speak, expressing the frustration of the viewer outside the TV, creating a community amongst the viewership, and speaking directly to the viewer. So when Jon Stewart starts throwing his pencils around and screaming at the camera in front of him, he's expressing what people on the outside of the TV might be doing when they're looking at the real news clips. And so he kind of connects with the viewer in a way that's very personal and points out and makes clear the kind of truth of the fakeness of some network and cable news. So the mimetic kind of performance of the TV news as a genre allows him to get at a particular kind of truth that might not have been visible when you just turn on CNN or, you know, the evening news. Someone like Stephen Colbert turned it a little bit more in terms of cable news, sort of attacking this kind of cable news world of the pundit, opinion journalism, and a kind of aggressive ideology, cult-like following of someone like, you know, Bill O'Reilly, or, you know, who knows, all of these sort of named, even Rachel Maddow has sort of cult-like following on MSNBC, where you know what you're getting when you turn on their news program. And so he was sort of really poking into that and creating his satire of the person who delivers the news, and this kind of personality journalism that we have kind of fallen into over the last decades as well. So, but to bring it up to the contemporary, the very, very contemporary period, one of my favorite performers at the moment, in the world of political satire, is Randy Rainbow, who has a YouTube channel and has for the last many years, at least since 2015, 2016, been doing political satire through song with these viral short clips that get millions of hits, using kind of contemporary political events and mixing them together with well-known Broadway or Hollywood musical songs. So from The Sound of Music, or here we have Spoonful of Clark's from Mary Poppins, I believe. And then, of course, Sedition is from Fiddler on the Roof. This one is great. It's on from West Side Story. So if you have this kind of cultural reference, if you know West Side Story, you know this kind of tension that exists in the song, Gee, Officer Krupke, then, you know, you can get sort of a little bit more resonance of the jokes of Gee, Anthony Fauci, where Randy Rainbow is kind of complaining about the pandemic and, you know, the administration at that time. This was in, you know, last year before the election. So I will just, I think, leave it there so we can allow time for questions. But really, I wanted to bring us into the current moment, because all of this, these political satires that we see in the 18th century, you know, we may not know the ins and outs of them. Sometimes we get the joke on one level, the visual level, or even the textual level. It may be the same thing in several generations. You know, we don't know. Watching the old Reagan clip yesterday, I don't remember the ins and outs of the Iran-Contra issues, but you can still get the joke. You can still see how it's relevant. But in that particular moment, it is extremely relevant, that it is very much touching on important issues that are of the day and of the moment. And we may lose some of that cultural context as time moves on, but we can still get the joke. And when the kind of visuals, the text match each other and present really smart, kind of challenging, provocative images and language, it's all the more successful. And so some of these sort of tropes of the ancient world carrying all the way through the centuries, but particularly this sort of highlight of the 18th century, and then what it has brought us to today, I think we can all profit from. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was great. I wanted to see those clips.
I know. I keep sorry. They're fantastic, and I'm happy to show them. But they're all at least six to 5 to 6 or so minutes long, and we can I'm happy to show any of them. But yeah, should I
need to send those links? We have a follow-up email going out tomorrow. We'll send the links out with that as well. So if anybody wants to follow up and view the full video for any of those, we'll do that as well.
Okay. Should I stop the share? Would that be?
Well, maybe somebody might make a reference to one of the pictures, so maybe not right away.
Keep it up? Sure, no problem.
So I'd like to start out. We have a great question to get us started. Are there any contemporary artists specifically engaging with 18th century satirical prints in their work? Particularly curious to know whether anyone is engaging with and pushing back against the imperialist, racist, and misogynistic aspects of these prints.
And I would have to say that I think people are pushing back against those things. Whether they're referencing the actual prints in the 18th century, I doubt. But I think that people are taking some of the techniques or some of the things that are developed, the idea of sort of exaggeration. Sometimes they do, the British do a print, contemporary editorial cartoonists in Britain will do a parody of a British 18th century print, but put different characters, put contemporary characters in it. But as far as using 18th century British prints, I haven't seen that. If anybody has, I would love to hear about it. But I don't. We have the Center for Cartoon Studies right here in White River Junction. There may be people who know about that there. Kristin, do you know of anything?
Not really. But I also think that the style and this kind of outline style, sort of quickness of execution. I mean, I think that's something we identify with contemporary political cartoons in, in all the major journals in the New Yorker. So that, I think stylistically, yes, I doubt, other than something like the plum pudding with Napoleon. I mean, that's of course an iconic image and maybe well known. A lot of the other ones might be not as well known, in which case the visual might not have as much impact. So, but I definitely think stylistically, I would say that, maybe in the 19th century, of course, the Hood has a huge collection of Daumier, a good collection of 19th century prints as well. And maybe some of the Daumier prints get used a little bit more in a more contemporary context, but I don't have a good answer for that. There are artists, Kehinde Wiley, who does really great. I mean, he's not a satirical artist, although some of his works kind of have a satirical edge to them. He does kind of redo classic art sometimes, or someone like Cindy Sherman in her sort of Masterpieces series would redo and sort of make fun of the dominance of some of these kind of misogynistic and racist imperial images, for sure. So it's out there, but I would think maybe more in a, not as much in the humor context.
Yeah, the one person I would say is Kara Walker takes the idea of the silhouette, which is a 18th century and into the 19th century, and it travels over to America. She's using silhouettes in a satirical fashion, deliberately making reference to white culture when she does it, and her biting images. But that's not making, she's not using 18th century British caricature.
So another question that we received is, There's a question wondering if any of these artists suffered any repercussions, which is a great question, of course.
Well, there's very little censorship in England of visual satire. There's censorship of text. And the one thing on the books was religious blasphemy. Gillray did an image of the Whig politicians kissing the rear end of one of the newly born royal babies, and they got in trouble for that. But most of the time, no, not in much trouble for the visual things. You do have suppression of people, especially after 1795 with the Treason and Sedition Acts, but it's mostly suppression of actual progressive groups. And the caricaturist, Gillray, was bought up by the Tories, the Conservative Party, for a while. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that that in France, I keep going back to France because that's sort of my main area, but in the 19th century, there was, the artist Daumier, who was, and his publisher, Philippon, where there was a lot of press censorship. So in times of a more, totalitarian rule, you do have, it might fall under press censorship. So artists were thrown in jail or newspapers were shut down in France because of royal censors. So if you attack the body of the king, and there are, of course, major examples of that, then you might end up in jail, and some of the artists did. So it certainly is risky. And, I think we know from the example of like the Charlie Hebdo situation in Paris that, attacking certain powers can put you in trouble, even if it's in the context of humor. But yeah, that would be the only examples that really come to my mind.
Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up today. If anyone wants to add a question to the Q&A, please feel free to pop that in. Otherwise, Kristin and Kathy, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I do think that the study of this material is interesting for cultural and societal attitudes, and it's an important field to study and to know about. Popular culture is often the clue to sort of the undercurrents of things that are going on, or sort of values, and the critiques of popular culture as well. So, by studying the Kardashians or reality TV, you get to certain things about what is appealing to a broader public. But those studies need to be nuanced. A colleague of Kristin's and mine, Angela Rosenthal, ran a Humanities Institute at Dartmouth, which had to do with visual humor and ideas of race, ethnicity, and nationality, which was it developed into a multi-volume book with numerous essays. And I think that's an interesting book to read. It was published in the last 8 years or so, to look at some of those ideas about how people are looking at, for instance, humor and Hitler. That has been very divisive. In fact, a show at the Jewish Museum was practically shut down over a board game that involved Hitler. So I think that was the case. So yeah, I just want to make a plug for study of popular culture.
Yeah, I would agree that, we're in an era where there's also a lot going on, or a lot developing online, and which is sort of a generational shift in terms of media. And of course, media studies has been following, the shift from, network to cable to internet. And when you start having viral sensations or various things, it is something to pay attention to. I absolutely agree. And also, you have these interventions that can happen in a very quick time frame. So you don't have to wait for a weekly Saturday Night Live. You can just throw out a video overnight, for instance. So the speed of popular culture can sometimes take us by surprise, also the sophistication. And I do think it is something that is very worthwhile studying and paying attention to over the next while as things change, as they surely will.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you spending your time and expertise with us here today with all of us. We thank all of you who joined us today. I would like to remind you that this program will be available on the Hood's YouTube channel in the coming days. We'll send out a follow-up email tomorrow with a brief survey, links to these videos, links to the YouTube channel. And I wanted to let you know that you will be able to see this installation from the larger Legacy for Learning from the Jane and Raphael Bernstein collection. This installation will be on view through August 29th. And on August 4th, the museum will be reopening to the public, and you can visit our website for our hours. There's also another way you could view this installation through our website. If you go to the exhibitions page to see what's on view, and I will send out a link to this as well, there is a wonderful 3D Matterport tour, which walks you through the exhibition with added didactics and information. So we'll send that all out. And otherwise, thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
Kristin. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Bye-bye.